The phone call started before sunrise. 3 continents, 7 boardrooms, one unmistakable message that would force the entire women's tennis establishment to its knees. Alex Eala's name had been left off a wildcard list that every analyst, every commentator, every person who understood tennis rankings knew she deserved. What happened next wasn't just about fairness anymore. It became about survival. Because when you ignore the player who single-handedly opened the most lucrative untapped market in professional sports, the consequences don't trickle down slowly, they detonate. And by noon on March 27th, 2026, the WTA had lost more sponsorship revenue in 6 hours than some tournaments generate in an entire season. Nobody at WTA headquarters in St. Petersburg saw it coming. They'd spent months celebrating their record-breaking Mercedes-Benz partnership, the $50 million per year deal that was supposed to cement women's tennis as a commercial juggernaut. They'd rebranded the entire tour, launched a new visual identity, positioned themselves as the future of women's sports. The 2026 season was meant to be a victory lap. Instead, it became a masterclass in how quickly empire building turns to crisis management when you forget who actually drives your audience numbers. The wildcard announcement dropped on March 26th during a routine administrative update. Tournament organizers for the upcoming WTA 1000 event in Madrid published their discretionary entries. Established names appeared, comeback stories got their chances, local favorites received their traditional slots. Then came the list of names absent, a list that included the 20-year-old from the Philippines who'd defeated a reigning world number 2, reached a WTA 1000 semifinal while ranked outside the top 140, and generated more social media engagement in 3 weeks than the previous year's entire clay court season combined. Alex Eala, ranked 29 in the world as of March 2026, the highest-ranked Filipino player in WTA history, first from her nation to crack the top 30, first to defeat multiple Grand Slam champions at tour level, the player whose Miami Open run in 2025 didn't just make headlines, it shifted demographic maps for how tennis organizations understood their growth potential. And somehow, inexplicably, she wasn't deemed worthy of a wildcard entry that had been given to players ranked 60 positions lower with a fraction of her recent results. The oversight might have sparked standard complaints from Filipino fans, angry tweets, some disappointed editorials in Manila newspapers, perhaps a few pointed questions at the next WTA media availability. Instead, it triggered something the organization's crisis management team had never wargamed, never anticipated, never built contingency protocols to address. Because Eala's rise hadn't just inspired a nation, it had fundamentally altered the business calculation for every major brand trying to penetrate Southeast Asian markets, a region representing over 600 million consumers that Western sports had historically failed to capture. Globe Telecom had been with Eala since she was 8 years old. They'd watched her develop from a promising junior into a player who could go toe-to-toe with the sports elite. More importantly, they'd watched their engagement metrics explode every time she stepped onto a court. When she upset Iga Swiatek in Miami, their branded content around that match generated more impressions than their previous quarter's entire campaign spend. They weren't sponsoring Yala out of patriotic sentiment. They were making the single smartest marketing investment in Philippine sports history. The company's executive communications team didn't waste time with internal deliberations. At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time on March 27th, Globe Telecom's official statement hit every wire service simultaneously. The language was surgical. No emotional appeals, no nationalist rhetoric, just cold business mathematics delivered with precision that made it impossible to dismiss as reactionary outrage. Globe Telecom has elected to terminate our partnership with the Women's Tennis Association, effective immediately. Our commitment remains to athletes who represent excellence, determination, and the values of fair competition. When governing bodies demonstrate through their actions that these principles are secondary to other considerations, continued association becomes untenable. We will redirect our sports marketing investment towards organizations that recognize merit-based achievement without organizational favoritism. The statement didn't mention Alex Yala by name. It didn't need to. Every journalist, every industry analyst, every sponsor relations executive watching the tennis space understood exactly what had just happened. A telecommunications giant with 80 million subscribers had just walked away from a multi-year agreement, citing the WTA's decision-making as fundamentally incompatible with their brand values. The implications rippled outward at network speed. Within 90 minutes, Bank of the Philippine Islands followed with their own announcement. Their phrasing carried even sharper edges. BPI have built our institution on principles of transparency, accountability, and recognizing achievement irregardless of political convenience. Recent decisions by certain sports organizations failed to meet the standards we require from our partnerships. Effective immediately, we are withdrawing from all WTA-affiliated sponsorship agreements and redirecting those resources to support athletes who have earned recognition through performance, not organizational favoritism. 2 sponsors gone before 9 a.m. The WTA's partnership department went into emergency session, conference calls with remaining sponsors, reassurances that these were isolated incidents, promises that the wildcard situation would be reviewed. Standard damage control language that assumed the bleeding could be stopped with explanation and adjustment. They were still thinking about this as a public relations challenge that could be managed through messaging refinement. They hadn't yet understood they were facing an existential market crisis. The third withdrawal arrived at 11:23 a.m. Nike didn't release a public statement. They didn't need performative announcements. They simply updated their official partnership page, removing all WTA Tour branding from their tennis division's association list. For a company that spent decades building relationships in women's sports, that quiet edit spoke with deafening volume. Sources close to Nike's Asian operations later confirmed what insiders already suspected. The decision came directly from their Southeast Asian market teams, who'd calculated that maintaining WTA affiliation while one of their signature athletes faced institutional dismissal would cost them more in regional credibility than the global partnership was worth. 3 sponsors, same day, combined annual value estimated north of $18 million, though the real number likely climbed higher when accounting for activation spending, merchandise collaborations, and regional licensing agreements. The WTA had just watched nearly a quarter of their non-title sponsorship revenue evaporate before lunch. But the dollar amounts, devastating as they were, represented only the visible damage. The real crisis was unfolding in markets the organization had barely begun to penetrate. The tennis world had always understood that Asian markets represented the sport's growth frontier. China's investment in the game had produced stadiums, tournaments, and a generation of competitive players. Japan had sustained professional tennis infrastructure for decades. But the Philippines remained tennis's sleeping giant, a nation of over 110 million people with rising disposable income, deep cultural connection to Western sports, and virtually zero established tennis infrastructure to compete with WTA potential investment. Alex Eala was the key if I could unlock that entire market, not theoretically, actually, measurably, with engagement numbers that made WTA business development teams recalculate their 5-year Asian expansion projections. When she reached the Miami semifinals in 2025, Philippine television ratings for her matches exceeded viewership for some of the country's most popular basketball games. Her social media reach dwarfed established WTA stars with higher rankings and more titles. Brands that had never considered tennis sponsorship began approaching her management team not because they cared about the sport, but because she'd become a cultural phenomenon with cross-demographic appeal that transcended athletics. She was 20 years old and already commercially more valuable than players who'd won Grand Slams. The wildcard snub wasn't just an administrative oversight, it was a strategic catastrophe that revealed how poorly the WTA understood the markets they claimed to be conquering. Tournament organizers had made a decision based on traditional calculus: established names, comeback stories, local favorites. They'd failed to recognize that the commercial landscape had shifted beneath them, that the player they'd overlooked had become more valuable to the tour's future than half the names they'd prioritized. Social media detonated within hours. Hashtag Justice for Eala began trending in the Philippines before 8 a.m. local time. By noon, it had spread to Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, the entire Southeast Asian archipelago, whose combined population exceeded Europe's. By evening, the hashtag was trending in 47 countries across 6 continents, driven not just by tennis fans, but by broader conversations about representation, merit recognition, and Western sports organizations' historical blindness to emerging markets. Filipino tennis fans, typically warm and supportive, weaponized their social media literacy with devastating efficiency. They didn't just complain about the wildcard decision, they compiled receipts, statistical comparisons showing Eala's results against every player who'd received discretionary entry, video compilations of her victories over top 10 opponents, revenue analysis demonstrating her commercial impact, economic projections for what Philippine tennis development could mean for WTA growth. For Eala, the situation created a paradox that she navigated with remarkable sophistication for a 20-year-old. She'd been vindicated, her value recognized in the most concrete terms possible, sponsors walking away from a major sports organization specifically because of how that organization had treated her. But that vindication came at the cost of becoming perpetually defined by the controversy, rather than her tennis. Every future wildcard she received would be scrutinized as potential capitulation to sponsor pressure. Every tournament entry would be examined for evidence that organizations were treating her differently because of her commercial leverage rather than her competitive merit. Her response to that impossible dynamic demonstrated the maturity that had made her such a compelling figure beyond her on-court achievements. She didn't gloat about the WTA's forced policy changes. She didn't criticize the organization in media appearances. She simply continued training, accepting the tournament opportunities that came her way, and letting her tennis speak for itself. The dignity of that approach made her even more sympathetic to the audiences who'd rallied to her defense, while denying critics any evidence of entitlement or inappropriate influence over organizational decision-making. The 2026 schedule redesign, when fully implemented, represented the most significant mid-season structural adjustment in WTA history. Beyond the wildcard modifications, the organization accelerated plans for tournament expansion in Southeast Asia. A new WTA 250 event in Manila was fast-tracked for 2027 announcement. Discussions about a potential WTA 500 tournament in the Philippines entered serious planning stages. Regional qualifying events got increased prize money allocations. Every adjustment served the dual purpose of addressing legitimate development needs while also functioning as acknowledgement that the Filipino market had forced its way into organizational priority through demonstrated economic power. Critics argued that capitulating to sponsor pressure established dangerous precedent that threatened the WTA's independence and integrity. They warned that allowing commercial considerations to override competitive criteria would corrode the merit-based foundation that made professional sports meaningful. These weren't unreasonable concerns, but they ignored the uncomfortable reality that Eala had actually earned everything the controversy secured for her. Her ranking, her results, her victories over elite opponents, these weren't fabricated by clever marketing. She was legitimately one of the 30 best players in the world who happened to also represent untapped commercial potential that the WTA had been too organizationally rigid to recognize. The situation exposed the fundamental tension at the heart of professional sports governance. Organizations like the WTA exist in perpetual balancing act between sporting merit and commercial viability. Pure meritocracy ignores the economic realities that fund prize money, tournament infrastructure, and developmental programs. Pure commercialism sacrifices competitive integrity for short-term revenue maximization. The Eala controversy forced the WTA to confront how badly they'd misjudged where that balance point currently existed, how much the commercial landscape had shifted without their governance structures adapting to reflect new realities. By mid-April, 3 weeks after the initial crisis, a fragile new equilibrium had emerged. Eala was competing in tournaments with appropriate opportunities for a player of her ranking and recent achievements. The WTA was implementing changes that would make future similar situations less likely. Sponsors were cautiously re-engaging in preliminary conversations about potential partnership restoration. The immediate emergency had passed, replaced by longer-term questions about what the entire episode revealed about power, representation, and institutional adaptability in global professional sports. The legacy of those 48 hours in late March would extend far beyond schedule adjustments and policy modifications. The crisis demonstrated that emerging markets could exercise economic leverage over Western sports institutions in ways that had rarely been seen before. It showed that social media mobilization, when backed by legitimate commercial stakes, could force organizational change faster than traditional advocacy approaches. It proved that individual athletes from non-traditional tennis nations could become more valuable than established stars from conventional markets if they captured the right demographic moment. Most importantly, it established Alex Eala as something more than just a talented tennis player from the Philippines. She'd become a symbol of how the global sports landscape was fundamentally shifting, how players from historically overlooked regions could force their way into recognition not through patience and gradual acceptance, but through demonstrated market power that made ignoring them commercially untenable. She hadn't asked to carry that symbolic weight, but the WTA's miscalculation had thrust it upon her, and she'd handled the burden with grace that only enhanced her stature. The question that lingered as the 2026 season progressed wasn't whether the WTA had learned from their error. They clearly had in the most painful way possible. The real question was whether the lesson would outlast the immediate crisis, whether organizational memory would preserve the understanding that tennis had become a truly global sport, where market value and competitive merit could no longer be evaluated through outdated frameworks designed for a different era. Because the next Alex Eala was already developing somewhere in some market the tennis establishment hadn't yet prioritized, waiting for their moment to force the same uncomfortable reckoning. Was this really about one wildcard decision, or was it the moment when women's tennis finally confronted the uncomfortable truth that their future belonged to markets they'd historically ignored, and the price of that ignorance had just been calculated in sponsors, schedules, and institutional credibility that might take years to fully rebuild? The wild card that almost destroyed women's tennis. 3 sponsors gone in hours, an entire season restructured under pressure. Alex Eala didn't just earn recognition through her tennis, she forced an entire industry to acknowledge that the game's future belongs to players and markets they can no longer afford to overlook. The crisis passed, but the power dynamics in women's tennis shifted permanently. And every tournament director, every sponsor, every administrator now understands when you ignore merit for convenience, the consequences arrive faster and cost more than you could possibly imagine. If this story made you rethink what you thought you knew about women's tennis, hit that subscribe button, because when sports organizations forget who actually drives their revenue, the fallout is just beginning. Tournament directors at other WTA events started receiving concerning signals from their own sponsor networks. Regional brands in Asia that had been exploring tennis partnerships suddenly went quiet. Conversations about tournament expansions in Southeast Asian markets stalled. The damage wasn't contained to 3 sponsors walking away. It was metastasizing into a broader credibility crisis that threatened the WTA's entire Asian growth strategy, a strategy that represented the single most important element of their long-term financial planning. Behind closed doors at WTA headquarters, the emergency response revealed how unprepared the organization was for this scenario. Their crisis communications playbook had sections on player controversies, tournament cancellations, sponsor conflicts over individual issues. It had nothing addressing the situation they now faced: a coordinated market rejection based on institutional decision-making that exposed fundamental misunderstandings about their own commercial ecosystem. The first internal response was predictable damage control. Draft a statement acknowledging the concerns, promise a review of wildcard allocation procedures, emphasize the organization's commitment to global development and merit-based recognition, standard organizational language designed to buy time while tempers cooled. But the executives crafting those talking points were operating from an outdated playbook that assumed this was a problem that could be solved with better communication. They still thought they were managing a public relations challenge, not confronting an economics emergency. Steve Simon, nearing the end of his tenure before Valerie Camillo's scheduled takeover, faced the uncomfortable reality that his final months would be defined by this crisis. Private calls with board members grew heated. Some argued for immediate concessions, grant Eala the wild card retroactively, make a public acknowledgement of the oversight, demonstrate responsiveness to market feedback. Others insisted that caving to sponsor pressure would establish a dangerous precedent that threatened organizational independence. The debate revealed deeper divisions about whether the WTA existed to serve tennis excellence or commercial partnerships, a question that should have been settled long before a crisis forced the conversation. Tournament directors at Madrid, caught between WTA protocols and cascading commercial pressure, found themselves in an impossible position. Their wildcard decisions followed established procedures and legitimate criteria. But those procedures had been designed for a tennis economy that no longer existed, that hadn't accounted for how dramatically the commercial value proposition could shift when a player from a previously untapped market demonstrated both competitive excellence and audience building power that transcended traditional tennis demographics. Yala's first public response came not through press conference or social media statement, but through her actions. She withdrew from a smaller tournament she'd been scheduled to play, citing the need to focus on training and personal matters. The statement was deliberately neutral, offering no criticism of the WTA, no comment on the sponsor situation, no engagement with the firestorm consuming women's tennis. That calculated silence proved more powerful than any condemnation could have been. It demonstrated control, maturity, and strategic awareness that made her seem more composed than the organization that had overlooked her. Her team, operating with sophisticated understanding of leverage dynamics, quietly let it be known through trusted media contacts that Eala was evaluating her options for the remainder of the season. The phrasing was deliberately ambiguous. It could mean anything from adjusting her tournament schedule to considering whether continued participation in a system that had failed to recognize her merit was worth the emotional investment. The uncertainty itself became a pressure point. What would it mean for the WTA's Asian strategy if their most valuable emerging market star decided the tour wasn't treating her with appropriate respect? The sponsors who remained began asking uncomfortable questions. Mercedes-Benz, whose record-breaking $50 million annual commitment had just been announced months earlier, requested a call with WTA leadership to discuss market dynamics and partnership alignment. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the implication was unmistakable. They'd invested in the WTA based on specific growth projections for global markets, particularly in Asia. Those projections assumed the organization would make strategically sound decisions about talent development and market cultivation. The wildcard situation suggested troubling disconnects between commercial strategy and operational execution. Hologic, whose title sponsorship had just ended, privately expressed relief to associates that they'd exited before this crisis erupted. Industry sources suggested that part of their decision not to extend had been concerns about the WTA's ability to execute on Asian expansion plans that formed the basis of their growth narrative. The sponsor fallout from the Eala situation validated those concerns in the most public way possible. By March 30th, 72 hours after the initial sponsor withdrawals, the WTA faced a reality that no amount of crisis management could obscure. They needed Eala more than she needed them. Her commercial value, her market access, her ability to open territories that had been resistant to tennis investment, these weren't theoretical projections anymore. They were demonstrated assets that sponsors were willing to walk away from major partnerships to support. The organization had somehow managed to position itself against its own most valuable growth driver. The emergency board meeting on April 2nd lasted 6 hours. When it concluded, the WTA announced what they described as a comprehensive review and enhancement of tournament scheduling and player allocation procedures for the 2026 season. The carefully worded statement avoided admitting error while signaling substantial changes were coming. Industry insiders understood what had actually happened. The organization had been forced to redesign significant portions of their calendar to ensure adequate opportunities for a player they'd dismissed as undeserving of a wildcard entry just days earlier. The specifics emerged gradually through leaked memos and tournament announcements. Additional wildcard allocations for high-performing players from developing markets, new criteria emphasizing recent results over historical achievement, expanded discretionary slots at multiple 500 and 1,000 level events, a commitment to ensuring emerging market stars receive appropriate competitive opportunities. Every change was phrased as part of ongoing evolution towards more equitable and merit-based systems. None of the announcements mentioned Eala by name. Every person following the situation understood that the entire restructuring existed because of her. Madrid tournament organizers quietly announced that additional player allocations would be made available, expanding their wildcard distribution beyond the original announcement. Eala received entry through a newly created slot for exceptional recent performance by players outside the top 20. The face-saving language fooled nobody. The WTA had blinked, the sponsors had won, and the player who had been deemed unworthy of consideration was now forcing institutional redesign through the sheer economic leverage her market represented. The sponsors who remained didn't immediately return. Globe Telecom's statement emphasized they were evaluating the organization's demonstrated commitment to substantive change, not performative adjustments. BPI remained non-committal, noting that actions over time, not reactive policy updates, will determine whether re-engagement aligns with our institutional values. Nike maintained their silent removal of WTA branding without comment or explanation. The message to the tennis world was clear. Credibility, once lost, isn't restored through press releases and emergency policy revisions. But the crisis forced conversations the WTA had been avoiding for years. What did merit actually mean in an increasingly global sport? How should organizations balance competitive achievement against market development? When does failing to recognize a player's commercial impact constitute institutional negligence rather than simple oversight? These weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were urgent strategic imperatives with multi-million-dollar consequences attached to getting the answers wrong. The broader tennis ecosystem watched the situation with a mixture of schadenfreude and concern. The ATP, navigating their own challenges with global expansion and sponsor relationships, took careful notes about what happens when governing bodies lose touch with the commercial realities driving their sport. Tournament directors began adjusting their own wildcard criteria to emphasize recent performance and market impact alongside traditional factors. The entire professional tennis establishment received a brutal education about how quickly power dynamics can shift when previously ignored markets mobilize economic leverage.